9.2 is speaking. Those countries that should be new countries that were not in that annex that should provide or continue to provide such support voluntarily. And now this is the kind of the discord part, which that's very hard right now in the negotiations we're going on the NCQG, which I'm going to talk about that after. We have Article 9.3. So Article 9.3 says, first, as a part of a global effort, right? So we are saying already, because of the different logic of the Paris Agreement, we already have a global effort in which developing country parties also have to do their part, right? So as a part of a global effort, developed country parties should continue to take the lead in mobilizing climate finance from a variety of sources, instruments, and channels, noting the significant role of public funds. This is a longer article, but this is kind of the part that I wanted to highlight on this. So this means that, yes, developed country parties have a mobilization obligation, if you want, but developing country parties also. So we also have to mobilize financing for climate action with the lead of developed country parties. Why do we note here the significant role of public funds? Because of the structural elements I was alluding to, public funds from developed countries help us mobilize additional resources to our countries. For instance, when we get a guarantee from a developed country, that diminishes us a lot, or reduces the cost of capital, and may make some investments more attractive in our countries. So this is why, for instance, public funds. On the blended finance, for instance, the concessional part of the blended finance instruments also come from these sources of finance. Public funds of developed countries, normally they could come from other sources, but this is kind of the trend is that they come from here. So this is how we see climate finance in the Paris Agreement from these two perspectives. One, it's how do we make all flows consistent with the pathway? And then what are the responsibilities or obligations from developed countries to developing country parties? Good. Now, what is climate finance? There is no definition. So first, and as I was mentioning, it is an existential threat, a challenge that require collective action. So everyone has to do its part. What does that mean? Is to the interpretation of each country, right? So what does it mean to do its part? That's a national discussion that we all parties have to make, right? But we'll have to do our part, whatever we mean by our part. And this requires substantial financial resources, yes, but there's no agreed definition, and the definitions right now take both approaches. So there's a very general definition that we use, but that speaks about everything and nothing. So right now, within the climate multilateral regime, we're trying to have these discussions. What's happened? Because we don't have a climate definition coming from the UN system, the different actors are starting to have their own definitions. So if you see, the MDVs have their own, the private banks have their own, and that's why this has led to a fragmentation of things that has a very high risk of greenwashing and of not having comparability of the methodologies that we are using for knowing what is climate finance. And right now, the trends of the definitions are skewed towards mitigation, so towards the reduction component of climate finance, and not as much as resilience, because resilience is harder to measure. So this is something that the international regime has to put pressure on to be able to balance right now. But the point is, whatever definition we take, climate finance or financing in general is a means to an end, right? It's a means to implement our commitments. And to translate ambition, the ambition we put on the Paris Agreement into, or translate it into tangible impacts that will really make us go towards what the of the PA, meaning the Article 2, is heading us towards, right? But then we have here a discussion that it's particularly relevant to developing countries, and that it's also kind of manifested in the way that we do this document I was talking about, the National Determined Contribution, in which we say, what are we committing to? Which is the relation between finance and ambition. So this is kind of the chicken or the egg discussion that we have. So what comes first? Finance or ambition? and what drives the other, right? And here we could have a plethora of options and very rich discussions, but just for you to understand how this comes to the NDCs is you have a conditionality element that is particularly relevant for developing countries, that in which we express what are we going to condition upon receiving funds, right? So we have countries that have conditioned a lot the measures that they're putting in NDC. So for instance, they say, okay, when I did my diagnosis, I saw that the agriculture and forestry sectors was a problem because they were very high emitting. I also saw that my transport sector was very high emitting. And I also saw, I don't know, another sector, like energy sector. Those are my 3 high emitting sectors, right? So what I did is, I'm going to propose this measure. So I'm going to reduce X amount of GHG emissions unconditionally, like whatever happens, that I am. But then I am going to promise or commit to a higher GHG emissions if, so this is the conditional element, I receive financial support for that. So this is how we condition, and this is more like the rationale of what comes first, right? So the ambition or the finance mix. Then we have other countries that did not condition their NDCs, also having the idea that if they had more ambitious NDCs, financial support would come, right? So they said, okay, I'm not going to tie my conditions under my NDC to this financing. I'm going to commit it, but with the underlying assumption that financing would come. By a fact, financing is not coming to either way. So whenever they tell us it is a chicken or an egg situation here, I always say there's no chicken, there's no egg. So, but this is for you to know, like, what are kind of the logics behind the way also countries frame their national determined contributions, and how do they condition or not their activities to financing. Now, the needs are in trillions. So the green part we see here is what we have right now on climate finance. Remember that there is no definition, so there are different methodologies to account it. Whoever you ask is going to have a different figure. But we have CPI. CPI is an organization that normally tracks, and that it's one that we use a lot, at least in negotiations. And they have this graph that I think it's quite enlightening. So this is the pink orangey part of it. It's the needs, and the green part is what we have. So now you can see how big the gap is between the needs and the available resources for climate finance. Now, this does not include transition-related unabated fossil fuel finance. That's why I'm saying, like, this has not been captured. So the needs are going to be, this is a subestimation or like underestimation of needs. If we go to the SEF, which is the Standing Committee of Finance under the UNFCCC, what they do is that they take all our NDCs and they see, or all the documents that we present, national adaptation plans, well, all the elements that can be costed, and they estimate, they add up the needs that we are saying that there are needs in these documents. The latest report, because we will be having another one coming up for this year's COP, it's saying that they are estimated between 5.8 and 5.9 trillion for the pre-2030 period. And let me say something, because I will take this opportunity to also send a message to all of our countries in our region, and is that our region is one that has the worst costing of all the globe. So if you see, there will be a needs determination report coming up from the multilateral level, and it's going to say that Latin America and the Caribbean is only in 1.77% of the needs. The reason why we are not presenting costing. And this is very, very, very complicated for our region, because what we are sending the message is that we don't have needs, right? Which is clearly not. Oh, sorry. Oh, I lost the Zoom part. The Zoom little. Okay. So this is very, very difficult for us and put us in a hard situation, because whenever we say, yeah, we have huge needs, and then They ask us, yeah, what do you need the resources for? Oh, I have no clue. How much does it cost? Oh, I don't know. What kind of resources you need? Oh, no, I don't know. Because we in the region have not come up with sound costing of the measures we are committing to, which also it's complicated for our countries, for our credibility, and also for us to be able to mobilize resources because we don't have that information, right? I see one hand up.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump into that, Sophia. Very interesting point that you raised. But I think the problem of the Caribbean, um, for most of the Caribbeans in costing is that um, what we need is more adaptation measures, right? Mitigation measures are not difficult to cost. But the problem is, and the biggest challenge is that costing of adaptation is difficult and finding also funding to for adaptation because mitigation always has a revenue factor in it that it pays back. But adaptation, oftentimes, it's very difficult to find funding for adaptation because we don't know if there will be any revenues to pay back. And that was also my concern. Oh, on one of the previous slides, let's see, I put a remark here. Um, that accessing private funding for developing countries is a very risky matter because developing countries are already into high debts. Accessing um, private funding will put them into much greater debts. That's why developing countries in the COP negotiations are really fighting for the focus on public funding and their kind of obligations to the developing countries for kind of compensating for the pollution that they are responsible for. Those are the remarks that I wanted to make. Thanks.
Thank you. And I saw another hand that was up. I think it was Marjorie.
I also saw another hand. I think it was Mayuri. Maybe I mispronounced the name. But at the end, we will also have a time for Q&As. So maybe we can leave that for the end, and so we can have time for you to finish your very enlightening presentation. Thank you,
Okay, perfect.
Sophia.
I don't know what I did here, and now I cannot have both you and the presentation, but well, I'll try to do my best because I lost part of this side. Okay,
Okay.
hope it works. So
In the
okay, well,
Zoom part, maybe. Okay. Yes, we
okay,
can see the presentation now.
okay. I will not see any hands right now, so I cannot see anything of the panel. But yeah, good. So and thank you, one, because this brings us to the NCQG and precisely what you're saying. But no, but first, and just to sum up what you're saying, the problem that the Caribbean is having, it's not only the Caribbean. Developing countries have most needs in adaptation. This is not only true for the Caribbean, but we will have to find a way to go along those lines, right? But how we cost things, and this is something also that I would like to mention here, does not have necessarily a relation with the revenue that it can generate, right? So what I do first is, if I have an adaptation intervention, how much that cost? Then my next question, yes, will be, what kind of sources do I have to cover that? But in the costing element, adaptation, precisely, yes, they're very hard to cost, but we will have to come up with something. Because the problem is that we keep saying that we need financing for adaptation, but we don't have the numbers. So if you see, like we say that we need trillions for energy transition, but we only need billions for adaptation. Why? Because of costing elements and not because of absence of needs. So I do understand and I do take your comment, Ewan, and that's pretty much like certain. And that's what's happening to all of us, including us. Yes, but we will have to go along and have some creative thinking about how can we start estimating costs, even for adaptation measures and loss and damage also. So yes, completely agree and understand, but also to say that other regions are costing. right? So if other regions are costing, even those including regions with high participation of small island development states and least developed countries, they are costing. So I think that this is also a structural problem that we have in Latin America and the Caribbean in particular. So this is the first. And just as a fun fact, the 60% of the costs of the very small costs that we have here in Latin America and the Caribbean are from Caribbean islands, actually. So there's also a push also for the continental Latin America to also think about how they're going to do their costs, because the very few we have is of Caribbean small island development states. That's also a fun fact of that number. Now, Iwan's point bring us to this very interesting discussion, which is what we are fighting for. And you are very precise, Iwan, in saying, what are we fighting for? So right now we have a mandate, like long time ago in Copenhagen, we had a commitment, but here when you have legal terms that everyone interprets according to, and we have a lot of legal creativity in the multilateral sphere, in which you have lots of interpretations. But let's say from the perspective of developing countries, we have a commitment, an obligation, because this is not how developed countries read. Whatever. So we have an obligation of 100 billion to mobilize to developing countries, right? So this was a long since Copenhagen. Then the Paris Agreement, what it did, it's just like it made a little bit longer the period that it would be kind of, I don't know how to say it in English, but like the period of implementation of the 100 billion, if you wanted to put it somehow. But the Paris Agreement also tells us that we have to replace this 100 billion. And we have to replace this 100 billion with a new collective quantified goal on finance, NCQG, because it's acronym in English. So when, again, legal interpretations in these, we could really do a contest on creativity on legal interpretations. This is something that you could be very much amazed with. But then there are countries that don't like the quantified, there are others that don't like the collective element of this, but the point is, this is called new collective quantified goal. However you want to interpret it, this is what its name is. But you could have hours of discussion on what the thing is and what that thing is not. The point is, this was, unfortunately, Iwan, the NCQG and colleagues, the NCQG was set within the context of Article 9.3. You remember we already saw like 9.1 was provision to developing countries. So this speaks more to the public funding element to us. Then we have 9.2 of the voluntary obligations, taking into account all those changes and realities and so on. And then we have 9.3, which was the mobilization element, which has everything and nothing. We have global efforts. Like this is kind of the tricky part of the story, because according to developed countries, they don't have an obligation to have provision of funding within the NCQG, which is the country of what we developing countries are asking for, as you very well portrayed it in your last intervention. So what we say as developing countries, and we have at least the experience of the 100 billion, in which a huge part of that 100 billion ended up being provision, unfortunately not good quality provision, because we got a lot of debt. And this is why I'm saying like the allocation of grant-based concessional finance does not respond to the Paris Agreement, but respond to other logics, in particular development cooperation. So that's why when we are middle-income countries, we get only debt, which doesn't speak to the fact that we do need concessional grant-based funding for adaptation measures, for instance, that don't have the risk-return profile for other sources of financing to come, or also loss and damages and other interventions that do not have this risk profile. But at the end of the day, what happens is that how we allocate has nothing to do with our ambition, what we do or what we don't do, who we are or who we are not, but on other type of criteria that responds more to the ODA type of logics for the allocation of finance. And that's one of the big problems that we have here. That being said, developing countries have been having a very, very strong voice calling for this public-based, grant-based finance, and also calling, and then we here link the dot with the definition of climate finance, because developing countries are more of the approach of the second part of the definition of finance than the resources for us, to say that market rates market rate instruments should not be counted as part of the climate finance that will come through the NCQG, among others. Whereas, and this is also a message that I would like you to take if you're especially working for your government, civil society, or others, and if you have any kind of margin of having this as a public message. Unfortunately, this goal that was supposed to be exclusively for developing countries, developed countries in their whole creativity are saying that what they want is a global investment goal. And I'm going to, again, try to explain what this means. So global investment goal, which is what developed countries are asking for, it's not only a matter of private sector. It's not only about that. What they're saying is that they want to count, as part of the NCQG, the resources of their investments between their countries. So they want to count the investments between the United States and Germany as part of the NCQG, and also their domestic investments. So Switzerland wants, for instance, I don't know, like I'm just taking random examples. Switzerland wants to count the investment that they're doing in Switzerland as part of the NCQG. And this is a very delicate situation because the NCQG is for developing countries, not include developing countries. So the huge and brilliant idea of developed countries was, let's have a global investment goal. Maybe we can have a sub-target of this global investment for private flows to come to developing countries. And then we would have what they call the core, which is a provision and mobilization goal to developing countries. That it's only for but then they say, oh, we have very strained budgets right now, so we cannot increase the resources that we are going to allocate for developing countries. But you have the outer layer, that's how they call it, that it's going to have trillions. Yes, but trillions for whom? Right? We have high cost of capital. We cannot compete against those developed markets. So if you have any way of bringing this, because civil society is until now just starting to understand the implications of this global investment. If you have a way to transmit it to your governments, to publish it somewhere, please do. Please do, because this is not fair. They're shifting for a goal that was meant to support us because of all the rationale I've just explained to something they want to benefit from. This is not fair, simply as that. And the only developed country that it's saying that the whole NCQG should be for us, including this investment layer and whatever, it's the United Kingdom. The rest are all willing to have this global investment. So please, this is my plea. If you have a way to scream this message, please do. Please do. Now, this is why we have. So what is it? So what is it for? So the question is like, what is it for? As I was saying, there's a lot of legal interpretation creativity in the multilateral sphere. So developed countries say that this is a global investment goal to implement the Paris Agreement in its entirety. So that means everyone. Then developing countries say, no. This is the global, this is a goal to support developing countries only, exclusively, thank you, my dears, with financing flows that are additional to the efforts that they are already making. Why do we say this? And that has to be crowd-boundary. Why do we always say this? Because also developed countries want to include domestic resource mobilization. So it's basically they're getting the applauses for the efforts we're already making. No. So this is what they want. This is what we want. So we want a provision and maybe a mobilization also goal, provision and mobilization goal that highlights the importance of public funds that are of quality, that are non-market rates, to help us implement our commitments because of all the reasons that we have already outlined. But then you see here huge differences. So what is the structure? Well, clearly this has an implication on the structure. So the structure of developed countries, they want a global investment goal with maybe as a goal for us, some provisions and mobilization, domestic resources. They even want to have fossil fuels targets there. They also want to, even some of them want to have carbon markets included. Like this is a Frankenstein, really. And then the structure that developing countries are proposing has been more of a provision and mobilization goal. Those would be kind of the core figures, and we would like to have provisions separated from mobilization, and then a structure that is based on thematic areas in which we have included mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage, at least. Some groups are also calling for just transitions, so financing for just transitions, and also cross-cutting finance for technology, transparency, and others. So this is something, and then there are like merging proposals that try to mix both, right? So this is very much how we are. Clearly, loss and damage is something that developed countries do not want to see by any means, but we'll see. Now, for whom? This is the question of the year. So, according developing countries, it is for us and the UK, for us, right? Certain developed countries want to reduce the number of developing countries that receive. So they say some developing countries, and they portray certain groups within. And then we have the other version that says include developing countries. So the goal is not for developing countries, but include developing countries at the core, at the very little core. So, okay. And then, so this is what we're having right now on the NCQG that we have to solve this year somehow. I don't yet know how, but this is what we have to come in agreement with. And then we have like the channels, right? The channels of how does this fund come from these very big commitments to us. So channels are a variety. The Paris Agreement is very clear not to prescribe the sources which, especially for those resources coming from developed countries to developing countries, are channeled. So we can have, overall speaking, well, bilateral channels. So USAID, for instance, is a clear example, or USAID is a clear example. So these are resources that are coming from the budget of the United States, of the taxpayers. They channel it to USAID, which is the Development Cooperation Agency of the US. And then they implement it in different ways, including through partner organizations. So this is one way, right? So it comes on a bilateral way, and they can include a package of countries they would like to allocate these sources with. So this is more on the bilateral. It comes from the negotiations of the different countries and the way they manage this fund. Then we can have a multilateral way of channeling funds, which is, for instance, and then here we could have like two options. So on the multilateral side, for instance, we have developed countries that provide funding, for instance, to UNDP, UNEP, or any other UN agency, FAO, I don't know. You just name them. And then for their climate action, right? So this is earmarked funding. Earmarked funding means that this funding is tied or conditioned to certain topics they can invest in. So this is kind of the multilateral way of getting financing for climate action. But this allows these UN multilateral agencies to have their own priorities and to invest in different countries according to their mandates. And then we have also from the multilateral level, like MDBs, well, multilateral and regional, because this is like, we have two levels of MDBs. So for instance, the recapitalization or capitalization of the World Bank and other MDBs, targeting climate related action. This is another way in multilateral ways how we can get. And finally, and I also saw that you will be having a session at the end of your course on operating entities of the financial mechanism. These are also multilateral, but the thing or the particularity of these operating entities of the financial mechanism of the Paris Agreement and the Convention is that they respond to the directives of the climate, of the COP and the CMA. So COP is the convention, CMA it's the Paris Agreement. So we have two operating entities that are clear for everyone that are operating entities of the financial mechanism. We have the Global Environment Facility. The particularity of the Global Environment Facility is that it serves many conventions. So starting with the three Rio Conventions, they are the operating entity of the three Rio Conventions. Then we also have other multilateral agreements that are also being, it will be serving, for instance, BBNJ. It also has chemicals. It also has like other multilateral instruments that go within it. And then we have the Green Climate Fund. The Green Climate Fund, it's different from the GEF in the sense that it only serves the Paris Agreement, the climate regime. So like Green Climate Fund is only for climate. GEF has a very specific mandate and serves many conventions. And now I have these two little white boxes, which are those that we don't really understand who they are. So they have identity problems within the regime. So first we have the fund for responding to loss and damage, just for you to know that we already have the host agreement with the World Bank. Those are great news that we will be showcasing in the COP in following weeks. But the point for responding to loss and damage is what I just mentioned, because developed countries do not believe they have commitments for the fund, like for loss and damage. So legally, they don't see it as an operating entity of the financial mechanism, even though we do give guidance to that fund. Guidance means like the COP and the CMA, well, the CMA in this case tells the fund what to do somehow, like without because these funds still have their boards, but without being too prescriptive, we get signals for them to take in their respective boards. So what is the legal status of the fund for loss and damage? That's a great question. I don't know. For developing countries, at least, it's one of the operating entities as the JEP and the GCF. For developed countries, clearly not. And then we have the adaptation fund. The adaptation fund is a little also sui generis figure we have in the regime that was created under the Kyoto Protocol to have some of the resources that came from some transactions for reducing emissions. And the idea is that the adaptation fund will also serve the Paris Agreement. So once we resolve the market issue, it will also have what we call the shares of proceeds, which is a percentage of certain transactions that would go to capitalize the adaptation fund. So so it is not really an operating entity, and it goes only for adaptation, but it is another and financial mechanism still within the region. So with this, I finish. I hope that it was very clear as much as I can. And this is just like the consistency of flows. Just to so I already finished like the article 9. I'm very fast here. So in this graph, this is one of the graphs that published the Standing Committee of Finance. This year, I think there will be a new report that will replace this figure with updated numbers. But what I wanted to show here that speaks to the other part of the story, which is the consistency of flows, is that it's not enough only to invest in climate action, but also to reduce the investments on those sectors and activities that are harmful to the environment. So if you see like fossil fuel investments, it's 892 billion, whereas all climate finance flows are 803 billion, right? So we have huge differences between here, like we have 1.890 trillion in harmful subsidies, and all climate finance is 803. So this also explains why the Paris Agreement has this Article 2.1c element. But yeah, with this I finish, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sophia. That was a great presentation. And now we open the floor for the participants if they want to ask questions, either for Sophia and also for Dr. Luis, who made also an excellent presentation early on. So please, you can raise your hand, ask your questions, or you can type them down in the chat and we can read them out loud for you. I can start with one question. I identified in the chat. I think it was for Dr. Luis. So it was from Ian. He was asking if you can please elaborate a bit on risk sharing in the context of PPP.
Risk sharing in the context of PPP. Thank you for that question. Frankly speaking, my experience is with small and medium-sized enterprises, producing food, producing wood, producing investments that go into short-term cycle crops all the way to multiple years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and more for wood production. So the examples I'm going to give you are not of the kind of multi-million investments in green finance, but there are some commonalities across those investments. First of all, private sector has a different clock when it comes to measuring risk. And when we promote public-private partnerships, is because we really want, as private sector, to have access to the advantages of a much, much bigger enterprise such as a government that can issue certain risk mitigation mechanisms such as green bonds. Green bonds are my first, and I probably come up with 3 or 4, maybe 5, my first risk sharing mechanism that the government can put in. Number 2, we cannot deny the weight of risk guarantees in a PPP as very important for the private sector to jump in, because the kind of risk guarantees and insurance programs that we see are an open, very clear invitation to share that risk. And so from the top to the bottom, I would say that's a very effective mechanism. And in developing countries, that's what we look forward to. Blended finance is more than 2 words. It means so much. Blended finance means how you can take advantage of the mechanisms for financing the government has versus probably cooperating with IDB, with World Bank, to have access to that and make the private sector investment much better. My last one, and maybe before last one, but my favorite when it comes to dealing with companies is something called first loss capital. If you have a public sector partner or an NGO partner, okay, that is willing to jump in to guarantee the first loss capital, it is a huge risk management factor for private sector to jump in. What does that mean? That means if I am willing as a private sector to finance 400 hectares of covered agriculture and we fail to generate a profit on year 3 or 4, that guarantee of first loss capital just gives me more oxygen as a private sector to keep believing in something like this. So I think those 4 are examples that come from real life scenarios, and hopefully that makes PPPs much stronger. Back to you.
Thank you, Luis. Thanks for the clarification.
Pleasure.
Yes, I think I can go ahead with another question that I got when I was listening to the presentation of Luis. You mentioned that the policy environment is also very important to catalyze these investments. So what would be a good example of the kind of policies that should be promoted in the agriculture sector in order to remain competitive and to have more access to this kind of finances? Thank you.
Hi, Silvana. Could you, sorry for interrupting. I couldn't hear what Silvana, the
Yes,
question that Silvana raised. Perhaps you could place your mic a little bit closer to the mouth, please.
yes, no problem, Iwan. And thank you very much for your participation. And I was asking Luis that if he could elaborate a few examples of good policy that can improve the environment to have better access to finance, specifically for the agriculture sector.
Thank you. And once again, these are only examples, and they come from my experience with supporting greener economy. I will say greener because some of the projects were already green, but now with the available opportunities for green financing, I have seen some of the movement towards gravitating towards those opportunities. Some countries are serious about policies that will create the kind of funding that will be up for blended finance. And their share of the action will go to very innovative activities such as revenue stabilization. Why is that an important policy to have as a government? Because if you are in an innovative green financing project and you know that the market is not really right for what you're going to produce, whether it's green power, whether it is a product that is certified green with any of the ongoing programs out there, you know that the income cannot be forecast the same way you forecast commodity trading. So it's possible that while you build that market base, your income is going to be, not what you expect. So that is a very innovative product, financial product, that allows you for 2 years to have enough revenue to cover your payroll, to cover your major expenses as far as investments, taxes, everything else. So that is one example of how policy can facilitate different ministries to access that kind of finance from whether it's GEC or any other source.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Dr. Luis. Appreciate the elaborate response. And now I would like to go with a question to Sophia, if I may. Hello, Sophia. Congrats on the presentation as well as to Dr. Luis. You both did like an excellent job. We are very happy to have you both here. So my question to Sophia is with regards to adaptation fund. And it goes also in line with what was mentioned by one of the participants, that is adaptation is always underfunded in the context of climate change. So in this regard, I always see that there is a topic for funding of the national adaptation plans. And I see that every year that's in the agenda, but yet every year there is not like advancement in this topic. So do you think it is going to be a more promising landscape with the NCQG, that it could be incorporated somehow into the NCQG? Or what is your opinion with regards to this? I hope you could listen to me better now, and then we will have Iwan as well to ask another question. Thank you.
This is as a challenging question to answer, actually. And what I would say, it's the following. It speaks to whose priority is for what data do you have to support it, right? So what's happening, and this is also something that you will see in the NCQG text right now that we will try to balance, is even though the needs and priorities of developing countries, evolving needs and priorities of developing countries have been very clear in terms of adaptation and now raising loss and damage, the priority for developed countries is mitigation, right? So even the existence of that agenda item is contested by developed countries, that they say that they want to merge the two agenda items that we have on adaptation to make it one, while we have always said we want an independent agenda item for NAPs, meaning national adaptation plans, also with a focus on right now turning not only financing for the elaboration of this, because many countries have already developed their national adaptation plans, but now for the implementation. So my thing is, there is already agreement, and there's also kind of, at least in the finance room, because it is not clear in other streams of the negotiation. In the finance room, there is a space for increasing the policy, kind of the awareness and kind of the political attention to adaptation, and the fact that the COP29 presidency also nominated 2 ministers to be as co-chairs for only adaptation, which is something that we didn't have before. So this is also sending a very strong political message. How this is going to be solved, I have no clue, right? So because many countries, like the issue we have here, and this is something that at least within our group we discussed a lot, is when we were trying to think about the structure of the NCQG, this adaptation piece I told you about, Like there were some ideas of, for instance, having a percentage of allocation of financing for adaptation, for instance. But then what it came after was like, if we do that, we could be prejudging the needs and priorities of developing countries. But the issue is that because adaptation is not a priority for developed countries, which are the sources of this financing, many times, especially because of the type of source that we need, which is more public-based than for mitigation, even though we're starting to see certain opportunities of the private sector for the adaptation, very slowly, but there's still like a little bit of hope. We said maybe not having a percentage in the NCQG that would not be beneficial. But then balancing mitigation and adaptation is also quite a difficult message to interpret, because how and balance against what, right? Especially if we have mitigation in trillions, and then we also have adaptation in billions, because of the problem that Iwan was mentioning, right? Because it's a costing problem, not a needs problem. So we'll try to do our best. I don't know what comes out of it. We're really, really doing our best of it. And we're also calling for resources for implementation, besides formulation, but I don't know, because we have also these kind of obstacles and challenges within the negotiation, which are like whose priorities is for, and the fact that we don't have the evidence also to say, look, the needs are this huge. So yeah, so this goes from those sides, but we do our best.
Thank you, Sophia. And now we have Iwan. Please go ahead.
Yes, Sophia. I have a point that I want to raise, as you mentioned, the loss and damage fund as a pillar under the NCQG. I was wondering if all developing countries were on the same page about this idea, and like to know if there would be any implications to the newly established loss and damage fund that has become operational during last COP28. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Iwan. And again, so those are two different elements. First of all, so first is calling for funding for loss and damage. But as I told you, the Paris Agreement is not prescriptive on what the channel is. And the loss and damage, the fund for responding to loss and damage is one of the channels, right? So what we would be doing if we have financing for loss and damage within the goal is calling for more financing for loss and damage, generally speaking. So it's a very big, broad quote. How do you channel it? That's another question, right? And you would have de facto, like the fund for responding loss and damage. So this would help capitalize actually the fund right now, in which we're not seeing a lot of increase of the pledges towards that fund. So this is the first element. So this is the positive elements. And we'll also increase the resources available for the funding arrangements, right? Because you know that the decision of the loss and damage have two components: the fund for loss and damage, and the funding arrangements, which is basically what others are doing to respond to loss and damage that it's not covered also on the fund, right? So it is the same. When we call for climate finance or mitigation finance or adaptation finance, we're just like making a big pool. How do you channel it? Then the Paris Agreement, it's not prescriptive. And if we call for increasing the funding channel through the operating entities, we understanding that as an operating entity, or there maybe not, but there's a lot of pressure there. So as we see it, there would not be risk. Actually, it would be complementary, because there are two levels of discussion, right? One is the big message of we need funding for this specifically. Then the other question is, how do you channel it? How do you bring it? And it could be, again, bilaterally, multilaterally, through other ways, or through the operating entities, or through other sources, right? So that's why we feel it's very important to have loss and damage. Loss and damage as an inclusion for thematic area has been a particular, I would say, like flag or priority for small island development states. So the group of AOSs, of small island development states, have been the ones that have been more vocal on bringing into loss and damage, and they have received support of the G77 in China for that, but a special priority for small island development states. And then your other question was, I remember the first part of the question, but I think that it's covered a little bit on the, oh yeah, it's,
Yeah, the
because the other part
implications
was
to,
supported.
yeah.
Yeah, okay, good. So I think it's both parts of the question are covered. Good.
Yeah, thank you
Thank
very much. That was very clarifying.
There is another question from Melanie for Dr. Flores. Luis Flores. Let me just read it for you. Um, Says, I found very interesting. Rice is very important to Guyana. What sorts of interventions do you think the nation should consider when implementing given the threat of climate change for rice specifically, Dr. Flores? Perhaps this is one of the last questions because we are running a little bit over time, but thank you very much for the questions and the experts and to everybody here.
So I can tell you 2 or 3 things that are working elsewhere with irrigated rice. But let me reaffirm to you that rice cultivation is not going away. It's one of the most important staples around the world. And I said in the chat line that the manual on what to do vis-a-vis climate change and rice has been written in the neighborhood by a good friend of mine, Eduardo Graterol. He's the head of the Fondo Latinoamericano para el Arroz de Riego, Latin American Rice Fund for irrigated agriculture, or rice, irrigated rice. That's it. Yeah. I'll send the contact information on the chat line, but what are the things that you can do? Number one, I think shorter cycle rice is important. It will impact how much water you're using. Improving the irrigation methods is another one. Third, I think making the case for higher yield rice varieties is important, and that has a lot to do with how you improve the seed systems around how your farmers access rice so that they can identify the best sources of certified, high quality, high yielding rice. And I can go on and on with other things. But again, the manual is being written for rice producers and for countries like yours, where rice is important and will remain important. And so pleasure to give you that contact info through the chat line. If not, if you don't get anywhere there, do contact me through Fernando or through Silvana, and I can make sure that you get access to that info. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Flores. I appreciate it. I'll look forward to the to that resource. And I'll also look for any additional information I could find online. But I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. So to finish, we would like to ask everyone to turn on your cameras if you can, please, so we can take a group photo of all of us. And then afterwards, for those of you who have more time, you can stay and we can go through the e-learning platform in case you have any question on how to use it or how to navigate the platform. So thank you. Thank you. I see the cameras on. So, give a couple of seconds so everyone can turn on their cameras. Perfect. Beautiful faces. Thank you very much. Okay, so on the count of 3, I will take 2 snaps because we cannot fit in one screen. So, okay. 1, 2, 3, smile. Now I'll take the second snap. 1 second, please. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us today. So if some of you want to stay on the call, we will go through the platform. The other people can just leave and we'll see you next session again. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sophia.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Sophia.
Luis.
Bye, everyone.